Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz, and this season we will be unpacking real trends, hot topics in the workplace around allyship and inclusion. Our goal is that each week you leave with tangible tools, information, practical strategies that you can take back to allies at your organization. Let's dig in to this week's topic. Welcome, everyone, back to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I am thrilled to have with us an ally and a friend. Dr. Kenneth Doka is an Autism and Grief Project Advisory Board member and the Senior Vice President of Grief Programs at Hospice Foundation of America and recipient of the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling. He serves as editor at HFA's Living with Grief book series and its Journeys Bereavement newsletter. He's a prolific author, editor, lecturer, past president of the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling, and a member and past chair of the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. In 2018, the IWG presented Dr. Doka with the Herman Fiefel Award for Outstanding Achievement in Thanatology, which hopefully I pronounced that correctly. And he received, thank you, and he received an award for outstanding contributions in the field of death education. He's an ordained Lutheran minister and licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York. Dr. Doka, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be on.
Well, I'm excited to dive into your journey, and I always like kind of starting with tell us about your work and how the Autism and Grief Project and how it helps adults with autism cope with grief and loss.
Sure. A number of years ago, the NLM Foundation put forth a call for grants because they recognize that, and that's a foundation providing support for people with autism. And what they noticed was that while there are a lot of resources for children with autism and grief, maybe not a lot, not as much as we'd like, but certainly some, there was almost nothing available for adults in autism. So the Hospice Foundation, which has always been interested in the issue of diversity, had a number of programs on cultural diversity, some programs on spiritual diversity, worked with persons with intellectual disabilities and providing grief resources for those people. We bid for the grant and we won it. And so we produced what I think is a wonderful resource that people can access easily on griefandautism.org. And what it is a web page that provides a number of information in diverse ways. Some through testimonials, some through just didactics style, and some through animations, which are wonderful, that talk about grief and how people in the autistic community experience grief. And I think what makes the web page unique is it has three major aspects to it, or three major portals to it. One is for adults with autism. The other is for their family caregivers, their intimate network, their friends and family. And the third is for clergy and other professional caregivers. So it really, I think, covers a lot of bases and a lot of diverse populations.
Yeah, that's super cool. I mean, and now that you mention it, as a parent of a child with autism, I struggle to find resources, but there are plentiful organizations that focus on children and neurodivergence, and just that whole conversation seems to be, people seem to have much more of an appetite for it. Whereas it's been interesting as I've had conversations with autistic adults, there's a lot of misunderstandings out there. There's not as much support, especially in something you don't think about, like dealing with grief. So I'm curious, why supporting specifically autistic adults when it comes to grief? How does your project help to close that gap?
Well, as a parent with a child with autism, I'm speaking to the converted here. But one of the things that that we do know is that and again, one of the things that I always like to stress is the diversity of the spectrum, the autism spectrum. So people on the autism spectrum vary in all kinds of ways, including the ways that we all vary in culture and ethnicity and social class, but they also vary on the spectrum. So some people are nonverbal, and some people are highly functioning. So you have a combination of people um, who are at all levels. I always like what one of the professors that we often quote in the project said. I forget who the person is, but he made the comment: if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And what he meant by that is, of course, you can't make assumptions about how people are going to behave when you're dealing with a spectrum of different responses. And of course, but one of the characteristics of autism is often the difficulty of identifying and coping with emotion, and also connecting to others, and of course, being able to process the range of responses that you have is important for grief, and getting social support from others is also important for grief. And so this creates particular problems for neurodivergent populations like people on the autism spectrum who may find it difficult for others to recognize their grief because they're not behaving in what we might call the characteristic or traditional ways. Maybe they're shutting down rather than emoting. Maybe there's different kinds of ways that they're expressing it. Maybe they're asking a lot of questions about details, because they want to master an environment that's now rapidly changed on them. So again, we felt there was a real need for this population to have some specialized forms of support, and for those around those people
Yeah.
to have specialized support.
Yeah, specialized support. And like you said, the spectrum of grieving and how people experience grieving for neurotypical people is vast, let alone for folks with
It's fast for
y-
everybody, but it's particularly
exactly,
yeah,
especially in the
yeah.
autistic community. Yeah, and the things they might wonder about or ask about. And what I've noticed, and this is a generalization, so forgive me, this isn't true for everyone, but for folks I know with autism tend not to have that social filtering that somebody that's neurotypical might have to, you know, and not that we can't empathize, but it just might be more fact oriented. Well, how did they pass? Asking questions that, folks in the neurotypical area might not dial in on that detail, like you said. And I
Yeah.
can understand how that be perceived differently. So I'm just curious, Dr. Doka, like, what are some of the specific challenges your organization helps with the bridging for autistic folks, and
Well,
just how we handle grieving in general? This isn't an autism issue. This is like a human grieving issue
Well,
too.
we provide lots of educational materials and informative programs and webinars. The Hospice Foundation of America does on grief and how grief affects us and the different variations in grief. We just did a program on prolonged grief disorder a few weeks ago. And I think here what we try to do is, first of all, validate the grief experiences of persons on the spectrum, persons with autism, by saying, these are some of the reactions you may have had, and these are certainly natural and normal and understandable. To provide education for those in both the professional and non-professional communities. So somebody like you can read and say, okay, yeah, I feel better now reading this because I'm beginning to understand a little bit how my son may be experiencing this, and I have a little information on ways that I might be able to support him.
Yeah, yeah. Knowledge is power. Having
And
that
knowledge is
knowledge,
support.
having
Yeah.
this resource is a safe place to go rather than an absence of knowledge. Sometimes we make assumptions and
Mhm.
assumptions that are based on stereotypes or things that are not true or not helpful.
Sure.
Um, Specifically, when you think about grief and how it affects adults on the spectrum differently from neurotypical individuals, what kind of responses might they experience?
Well, again, it's hard to generalize, as you said earlier, because it is such we're dealing with two spectrums here.
Yeah.
a grief spectrum of how people
Right.
react to grief, and then the spectrum of that's a person's with autism. But for instance, they may be reluctant. Certainly, one of the things that persons with autism struggle with is change. Routine can become very important and a very important coping mechanism. And one of the things about grief and loss is whenever we have a significant loss, one of the tasks is dealing with the life changes that are mandated by that loss, which sometimes may be relatively minor, depending on how remote the person is to you. But if it's a caregiver or a parent or somebody who's very significant in your life, a spouse, those changes can be highly profound.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Two spectrums, the grieving spectrum, right, and the autistic
Yeah.
spectrum as well. So depending on somewhere is where they are, and like you said, the closeness to the person is going to impact it, especially, caregivers, changes to routine. That's something
Yeah.
I notice. Again, a little one, not an adult, but
How
the
old is your child?
transitions, three.
Oh,
So
okay. So you're
transitions are.
just getting initiated into that world in some ways.
We actually just recently got the formal diagnosis. So the school, gave us a heads up this was likely, but to go through the whole formal process was an event, 6 months actually. So being now looking for resources and knowing that that transition process, that change process is, I see it with her. She's fine as long as
Oh,
she's
I'm
in
sorry.
the
I thought it was your
environment.
son. I'm
Oh
sorry.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's okay. Her name's Dylan, so people get the gender confusion with the name happens too. So there's a whole bunch she's gonna navigate life. We're along for the ride. But I can see how those changes and transitions, as I've known autistic adults too, and it's not a monolith, like you said, like everyone's gonna experience this differently. But I can understand how that change process, because grieving is kind of like a change management process, letting go of something and
Sure.
replacing it with something new.
Yeah. Or just you have to adjust to a changed life, and that's one of
Yeah.
the literally what we call one of the tasks of grief. That your life is now going to be different again. Um, Maybe in minor ways. You don't go to grandpa's for Christmas if it's grandpa. But maybe in major ways where you may have to change your home, or you may have to move, or the
Mhm.
changes can sometimes be profound
Yeah.
and cascade.
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Toka, I'm curious if there are specific ways that you've seen the impact of the tools since the inception of the project. Have there been, a specific instance in general that you could share, or just ways that you've seen people manage the grieving process?
Yeah, I think if we look at the comments we've gotten, people have basically said to us, we haven't done any evaluation research on it yet, as to how effective it has been, but we get a lot of anecdotal material on that, and what the anecdotes say is, I was worried because my adolescent son, or my adult son, old adolescent son or adult son, didn't really cry much, or didn't want to go to the funeral. And now I've got some understanding of that.
Right. Because I think people judge that as like,
Oh
how are they not upset? How are they not
yeah,
crying? And emotions, if I understand this is, correct me if I'm off base here. I'm totally open to feedback, because I want to be representative. But for folks with autism, the emotions that you sense from others, it tends to be more fact oriented, more detail oriented. Emotions, although they express emotions and can read emotions, it just may not be what you lead with, if you have autism. Is that
yeah,
fair,
yeah.
or correct me?
No, I think there's some value in what you're saying. I think there's validity in what you're saying. Again, recognizing we're on a spectrum, as we're always
Right.
going to say, but I think that's very true. And there's another thing about neurotypical people. We walk in, we may not even realize we're going into a funeral, but we walk into a room and we
Hmm.
see everybody, kind of sober, and we pick up and we respond to those cues. Um,
Hmm.
and often persons with autism are not necessarily as responsive to the social cues that are presented by others.
Right. Right. I have seen that, and the degree to which some autistic people will mask or learn how to pick up on those social cues, especially women, just from the socialization that you
Yeah,
endure, but it's not as natural. Whereas
yeah,
viscerally, I can step into a room and see grieving and feel sad. That may
yeah.
not be a natural reaction for somebody that's not
And
neurotypical.
you see everyone sedate, and you know that you've got to present yourself in that way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that emotional contagion seems a bit stronger. Yeah, that's interesting. If there were, I'm sure Dr. Oka, I'm sure you have many wishes for the autistic community and grieving, but if there were things that you could see that we could improve in society or in our systems, or just sort of thinking about folks with autism and how they grieve, what would you hope people better understood?
Well, again, I think that to acknowledge grief, first of all, to recognize that everybody, including persons with autism, responds to grief in different ways. To find the ways that you can be of best support, and probably one of the populations that, if I had a wish list, that I wish would be looking at this website, would be employers of adults with autism, because I think, that's an area where great sensitivity is. And one of the things, of course, that's one of the things I'd also want people to understand is that one of the other things I would like people to understand from this website is that we don't only grieve deaths. We grieve breakups, we grieve changes in relationships, we grieve lots of non-death losses, such as job loss, which can often be a very serious loss for autistic adults. So we really want to emphasize, I think, on this webpage, it's not just about death, it's about loss. And persons with autism, even if they're in a group home, for example, and a significant caregiver leaves, not necessarily in a bad way, to take another job somewhere else, to move, to get married. Um, that there's a grief process that goes on there too. Somebody who
Mhm.
was part of my life, who I was attached to, is no
Yeah.
longer there. Grief is not about death and dying. Grief is about attachment. We can
Mm.
become attached to pets. We can become attached to objects, and some of that can happen even a little bit more acutely in persons with autism. You know,
Mhm.
I've seen children with autism and adults with autism who, I've had one kid tell me my cat is the only person who really gets me.
Mm.
You know,
I love that.
yeah, and so again, people create all kinds of bonds. That's just not people with autism; it's people generally.
Yeah. Yeah, that emotional support companion. And yeah, whether
Yeah,
that's animal, a caregiver, yeah, and it doesn't have to be death. The
yeah,
grieving of the loss of the relationship or the context of the relationship changing can
yeah.
be
Or the
hard.
multiple losses we experience from job loss. You've not
Hmm.
only lost maybe a sense of your self-identity, but a sense of connection to others around you.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think you're back to your point about employers paying attention. The statistics on autism, 1 in 36 births right now in the United States diagnosed with autism on average. And then the unemployment rate, depending on what data you look at, it's as high as 85%. And so we have a huge problem with how workplaces are built for a vastly changing workforce that's coming
Yeah.
quickly. So employers are going to have to get better at getting that. Dr. Doka, along that line, like what could employers do? Just overall inclusion, but also understanding this grieving process, the impact of change on autistic people. What would you hope employers did differently or learned more about?
Well, again, to learn more about the grieving process, to maybe recognize this is a point when they're going through a lot of change where stability at the work front becomes of increased importance. So doing what you can to stabilize that, at least that environment for the person, could really be a great gift.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it reminds me of the work I do in change management sometimes. It's just early and often communication, no surprises,
Yeah.
reassurance of what is staying the same, what is changing, be clearly communicating that because autistic mind and in general, this benefits us all, but especially for folks with autism, being very intentional with your communication about what exactly to expect so that they
Right.
don't feel, this overwhelming,
And,
huge
and
change.
yeah, and providing support through those transitions.
Yeah, yeah, the transition process. Dr. Doka, I'm curious about the future of the project. What do you see as the future for the Autism and Grief Project? What does the future hold, and how can our audience support it?
Well, I think first of all, join come into our website uh, early and often, as they say, autismandgrief.org. I think another thing is that, that this is, I guess the project is now in a kind of stable period. It's up there, hopefully, as more research comes out, as we get more feedback, we'll modify it. But right now, I think we've got a really good website up there that's going to be a critical resource, and I see our job in the future is just maintaining it and improving it as we know more and learn
Yeah.
more through the project.
Yeah, knowledge, information. Yeah, excellent resources there, audience, to check out and to follow and support. Thank you so much for your meaningful work, Dr. Doka. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that would be
No,
important for our audience to know?
I think you did a wonderful job in really, how would you say it, pulling out all the information that your listeners need to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, listeners, and thank you for your important work. So thankful. Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. My hope is that you walked away with a tangible tool, insight, or information that you can share with other allies on the journey. If you liked this week's episode, please leave us a review. Your feedback means a tremendous amount to us. We'll be back next week with another hot topic.